In August 2020, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that based on the guidance of the president, the United States will cut over $100 million in funding for Ethiopia due to Ethiopia's decision to start the first phase filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. This unusual and unprecedented decision is even more confusing considering the fact that President Trump has never even attempted to visit any African countries or ever rarely mentions Africa or Ethiopia in any of his speeches. Despite concerns from his party and opposition from Democrats over this action due to the fact that the US was supposed to act as impartial mediators in negotiations between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, the Trump administration confirmed the fears of Ethiopian negotiators that the US favored Egypt's position by moving forward with this action that jeopardizes over 100 years of cooperation and friendship between Ethiopia and America. This favoritism should not come as a surprise to Ethiopia, as President Trump proudly announced at the G7 meeting in September 2019 that President Sisi of Egypt was his favorite dictator. Ethiopian negotiators walked away from negotiations as they realized that the US was using its significant leverage over Ethiopia to force it to sign a deal that gave away its rights to the Nile water. Instead of using seasoned State Department negotiators to assist as impartial mediators, Trump assigned Secretary of Treasury Steve Mnuchin, who has very little experience or knowledge in these matters, to handle the negotiations. It came as no surprise to Ethiopia that in February 2020, the US, along with the Egypt and Sudan, completed an agreement without final input from Ethiopia and signed an agreement reminiscent of the 1929 and 1959 deals, except that US replaced Britain as the financial colonizers. The GERD, as the dam is known, was first envisioned by Haile Selassie in the 1960s as he brought in American engineers to design a series of small dams along the Nile to bring Ethiopia out of darkness and harness the Nile waters to produce electricity for his nation. This noble idea had to be shelved due to the political instability arising in Ethiopia, along with the financial inability of Ethiopia to raise the funds for this project due to Egypt's objections. Using the surveys conducted by the United States Bureau of Reclamation around the 1960s, the Ethiopian government announced on March 31, 2011, the start of the construction of the $4.8 billion dam, with the Italian company Salini Impregilo as the company to lead the construction of the dam. Upon completion, the dam is expected to more than double the Ethiopian electric capacity to 10 gigawatt. In comparison, Egypt, which has almost 100% electrical coverage for its citizens, generates over 38 gigawatt of electricity for its population of 100 million people. In a nation where 70% of the population is not connected to the electrical grid, the GERD is expected to provide electricity to almost all of Ethiopia, along with consistent electricity to the other 30% that are currently on the grid. On top of this, Ethiopia expects to sell the excess electricity to neighboring countries to generate over $1 billion in annual revenue for the country. When adding up all the benefits, the GERD is expected to add $8 billion to the Ethiopian economy in the first full year of operation. Besides the benefit of providing cheap electricity to Sudan, the GERD is expected to control flooding for Sudan and open up huge amounts of land for agricultural projects, along with controlling the level of soil erosion or silt that heads downstream and clogs up the dams of Sudan and Egypt. Despite all the positive evidence, Egypt has taken a strategy of presenting itself as a victim of Ethiopian aggression, and that attacking and bullying Ethiopia is better than finding a solution that works for all parties. It's ironic that while Egypt tries to blame Ethiopia for deciding to fill the GERD without an agreement signed by all parties, Egypt forgets that its claim to the waters is based on the agreement signed in 1929 and 1959 that excluded Ethiopia from negotiations on any agreement signed by the parties. More ironic is the fact that Lake Tana in the Ethiopian highlands provides almost 85% of the water that flows into the Nile. The agreement gives Egypt 55.5 billion cubic meters, while Sudan gets 18.5 cubic meters, and the remaining 10 is allocated for evaporation and seepage, and thus the other poor countries that the Nile travels through are not allowed to use the water or build any hydroelectric dams without the permission of Egypt. Sudan, which is allocated 18.5 billion cubic meters, actually only uses about 13 billion cubic meters of water due to its inability to develop its agriculture from extreme Nile flooding, and thus Egypt is able to use that excess water. In the original agreement in 1929, Egypt and England, on behalf of its colonies, Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, signed the agreement that dictated the use of the Nile. Ethiopia, which was never colonized and recognized as an independent country, was never allowed to participate. In the 1959 agreement signed by Egypt and Sudan, while Ethiopia was planning its own dam, again allocated the waters to only the two nations, while allowing them to veto any projects upstream. Is it then a coincidence that after this agreement that the political instability started developing in Ethiopia? At the start of the GERD in 2013, Egyptian politicians were recorded discussing how to cause instability in Ethiopia as a way of stopping the construction of the dam and starting an indirect war to isolate Ethiopia politically and economically so that it could not attract foreign investment and political support. If any country should understand how much a dam can transform a country, then it should be Egypt, which built the Aswan High Dam between 1960 and 1970 to much celebration by its people, and at full capacity provided 50% of the electrical needs of its people upon completion. After being turned down by Britain and the US for the $1 billion it needed to build a dam, Egypt turned to the Soviet Union, who in turn gave Egypt the loan. In order to secure the loan, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, which was built and managed by both Britain and France. Due to this action, Britain, France, and Israel attacked Egypt, and only after pressure from the UN and the US did they recall their troops and allow Egypt to continue to build the dam. Upon completion, the dam was such a success that Egypt was able to pay off their loan in only 2 years. Yet Egypt responds with anger when Ethiopia states that it will go to war if necessary to defend the GERD. Unlike Egypt, Ethiopia did not have the luxury of the Suez Canal or a large loan from another country due to Egypt's effort to block any assistance. Instead, rich and poor Ethiopians voluntarily and by force gave up what little money they had to help finance the $4.8 billion dam. While millions were dying in Ethiopia and Sudan in the early 80s due to drought, Egypt went on with business as usual as they were able to release the water stored at the Aswan Dam for their farmers and even managed to export food for additional income. Yet Egypt claims over and over that Ethiopia needs to survive on rainwater for irrigation while they utilize the Nile to feed their people. How generous would Egypt be if the Nile flowed south from Egypt and it was Ethiopians who depended on the water for survival? Egyptian politicians, farmers, and experts appear on television with claims to the world that the GERD would lead to the death of their farms and cause their people to go without drinking water. Although Egypt does suffer from very little rain and is feeling the effects of global warming, it turns out that the biggest issue is that Egypt has wasted their water supply with poor management, inefficient irrigation systems, and bad policies that enrich large agricultural companies. Almost 85% of Egypt's water is used for agricultural activities, and that agricultural wastewater, tainted with chemicals and pesticide, is dumped right back into the Nile, making the water undrinkable. While countries like Israel, who has half the water supply of Egypt, have declared that they have a water surplus Due to efficient water usage, Egyptian politicians has found it easier to blame Ethiopia and distract their citizens from the ineffective and self-serving policies implemented by the state. In August, the Egyptian Minister of Agriculture proudly proclaimed that Egypt will export 6.75 million tons of food in 2020, which was an increase from the 5.58 tons they exported in 2019. In fact, Egypt announced with pride that in a country that is 90% desert, that they have surpassed Spain to become the world's largest exporter of citrus fruits and have planted over 12 million orange trees to expand their production. Despite repeated warnings by major institutions, Egypt still continues to grow wheat, rice, and cotton, which requires very high water consumption. All this while 70% of their farms use inefficient conventional agriculture that wastes lots of water and pays no attention to the limited water supply that Egypt possesses. Egypt proclaimed that they plan to increase exports to 100 billion in 3 years, while Ethiopia struggles to reach 2 billion in exports. Yet, it is the Egyptians who claim to be victim of Ethiopia's attempt to steal Nile waters from them. And Egypt has had every chance to work with other Nile countries to reach an agreement that is fair for everyone. Before Ethiopia started working on the GERD, all the countries of the Nile, with the blessing of the World Bank, formed the Nile Basin Initiative and worked out an agreement of water sharing. But Egypt and Sudan walked out of the agreement because it didn't follow the 1956 agreement signed by only Egypt and Sudan. Egypt was not interested in a compromise, but in only bending the will of the group, and when that did not work out, they sought to illegitimize the agreement by not signing it. Without Egypt and Sudan, 6 countries went forward with the agreement, and based on that agreement, Ethiopia moved forward with the construction of the dam. Egypt has decided to take the attack on Ethiopia to the international level by first presenting it to the Arab League of Nations, which Ethiopia is not a member of, and making the unprecedented decision to take the dispute to the UN Security Council. Both of these moves proved ineffective, as Ethiopia moved forward with the first phase of filling the dam as seasonally high rains and the Aswan Dam being above capacity proved Ethiopia's point that filling would have no effect on Egypt's water supply. The filling, which took 4.9 billion cubic meters of water, was something that Egypt had already agreed to and constituted only half of what Egypt allocated for evaporation and seepage. Even more, studies have shown that due to the desert temperature of Egypt, water evaporation will be much lower with the water stored in the GERD versus the Aswan Dam, so that in the long run, additional water will be saved. Yet, despite the success, the US, with the encouragement of Egypt, decided to cut funding allocated for Ethiopia's security and clearly demonstrated that the Trump administration was all along on the side of Egypt rather than an impartial mediator. How could we, as Ethiopians, help our country in its fight to overcome poverty and darkness with the development of the GERD? Here are some simple solutions. If you're an American citizen, this is the perfect time for us to demonstrate our voting power, since the elections are only 2 months away. With the census showing that over 500,000 Ethiopians live in America, it's time for our voice to be heard and overwhelm the estimated 250,000 Egyptians that will support Trump for his decision. First step is to verify that you are registered to vote. Go to the website www.iwillvote.com and verify that you are registered to vote. Second, go to change.org website prepared by the Ethiopian American Civic Council, and in a couple of easy steps, you'll be able to send the president and his staff, your local elected officials, letters condemning the current action of the administration and asking for a change of course. All the links will be listed below. Third, as Trump has shown no signs of reconsidering his decision to pull support for Ethiopia and has even taken the additional step of encouraging the IMF and World Bank to pull their support, go to joebiden.com, fill out your information, donate an amount that you can afford, and put in the comments that you want Joe Biden to continue the funding to Ethiopia. For those that live in Europe, the Arab countries, especially Israel, write letters to politicians so that they do not follow the American lead and cut funding from the European Union, World Bank, or IMF and put Ethiopia in a weak negotiation position. Last but not least, to all the Ethiopians living in Ethiopia, let the GERD dam unify you. Come together as a nation so that by plans of Egypt to destroy our country will fail and we can rise as a nation.